Today, we are discussing the National Flood Insurance Program versus private flood insurance. We're going to be discussing 5 things, and this is your guide to understanding flood insurance. So if you're a homeowner, if you're an investor, or you're a commercial business owner, make sure to tune into this video. By the end of this video, you're going to have a pretty good idea which one of these insurance options is the best solution for you. Hello, my name's Chris Green, president and owner of the FloodInsuranceGuru. And more than 12 years ago, I bought a house just like this in this area and was told that flood insurance premiums were going to be $3,000 when they should have been $300. My family and I almost lost out on this dream home. And for the last 12 years, I've been helping people overcome these same obstacles. So today, we're talking about guide to flood insurance. We're talking about the National Flood Insurance Program. We're talking about private flood insurance. We're discussing 5 things in this guide. We're talking about coverages. We're talking about pricing. We're talking about availability. We're talking about wait periods. And we're talking about claims, which is very important. So throughout this video, if you want to jump to a certain section of video, this video is going to be broken up into chapters for you, where you can jump maybe to the section that you want to learn more about. Also, make sure to stay tuned all the way to the end of this video for more resources to help you understand the differences between these two, what might be the best fit for you, as well as some downloadable resources as well. So let's talk about the first thing today, coverages. Let's talk about the National Flood Insurance Program. What coverages do they offer on a residential house, just like this one right here? When it comes to the National Flood Insurance Program, if you were in what's called a participating community, this is about 99% of the communities across the country. They offer building coverage up to $250,000 on a residential property. They offer contents coverage up to $100,000. Now, it's important to understand that as this video is being shot in 2023, the National Flood Insurance Program does not offer replacement costs on contents. It's also important to understand that generally, they require your property to be either insured up to that max limit or 80% of the replacement cost, whichever one of these is of lesser value. And if you don't insure for this with the National Flood Insurance Program, these policies default the actual cash value. This could be a big issue for you come claim time. So you want to make sure to understand it when we're talking about coverages here. Now let's talk a little bit about pricing with the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, pricing with the National Flood Insurance Program is going to depend on each structure here behind me. There's a few different things that help determine the price with the National Flood Insurance Program policy. It's replacement cost of the building. It's distance to water, like you can see right here behind me. Elevation above that water source. It's flood frequency, the type of flooding. If flooding increases in an area, then you may see rates with the National Flood Insurance Program change from time to time. So this is how they determine pricing. So what about flood zones? Now, it's important to understand with the National Flood Insurance Program now in 2023, flood zones no longer have an impact on flood insurance rates. They're strictly used from a regulatory standpoint. Now, what about availability? Is the National Flood Insurance Program available everywhere? No, it's not. There are certain areas and certain situations where it's not available. Let's talk about what those are called. So when we're particularly talking about here what's called non-participating communities, these are communities that do not participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. These are going to be communities that either had a violation or they just can't take on financial burden of doing all the mitigation requirements the National Flood Insurance Program requires. This means, generally speaking, the disaster assistance and disaster grants are not going to be available in this area if a community chooses not to participate. Now, generally, this is probably less than 1% of communities across the country, and it's usually very rural areas. Other areas that may also fall under this may be what's called CBRA areas. These are coastal barrier relief protection areas. These are generally properties that either have been improved or built after roughly 1990. Sometimes it could be a little bit earlier. Sometimes it could be a couple years later. Generally, in these situations, the National Flood Insurance Program is not available. So those are coverages, and that's pricing, and that's availability with the National Flood Insurance Program. Now let's talk about wait periods. Now, with wait periods with the National Flood Insurance Program, you generally have 3 different types of wait periods. You have no wait period for a loan closing, like you could probably see on this new house behind me where this family is getting ready to move in right here in the water. They're wanting to make sure their property is properly protected by flood insurance, but if they were doing a loan closing, not a real estate transaction, but a loan closing, they would have no wait period, so they can make sure their property is protected right away with the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, let's say this area was recently mapped into a high-risk flood zone. I know, because I personally had that happen on my property. That means I would only have a 1-day wait period with the National Flood Insurance Program. What if I was lucky enough to pay cash for a property like this? And generally, I'm going to have a 30-day wait period here. Or maybe I'm an investor buying this that does not include a loan closing. Then I'm going to have a 30-day wait period. So those are the different wait periods. Now let's talk about claims. Now, when it comes to claims with the National Flood Insurance Program, these work very uniquely. With the National Flood Insurance Program, if you don't like how your claims process is going, you might be able to do an appeal up to 60 60 days. You may be able to take a look up, hey, I had this much coverage, but you're giving me a check for this amount. Or, here's my documentation of the damage I had, because we always recommend taking videos, just like this one right here, taking photos to document those damage to show an adjuster when they come out. Here's what was damaged that I had to throw away, that I had to get rid of it. So that's the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, let's talk about private flood insurance, and then we'll kind of move on maybe to what we feel sometimes is the best fit for maybe you as a property owner, maybe you as an investor. Now, with the private flood insurance, let's first of all talk about coverages. We talked about the National Flood Insurance Program having $250,000 on a residential building, on $100,000 in contents. In many situations, private flood insurance is actually going to offer more than this. They can actually offer, in many situations, true replacement costs. Now, it's important to understand that when you're looking at these coverages, though, one of the big differences between private companies and the National Flood Insurance Program is that in many situations, private flood insurance can offer replacement cost on your contents. That means that TV you bought 10 years ago, you may actually get the money to replace it today, not what it cost to buy it 10 years ago. Because with this economy, you can imagine how much you would actually get for that TV, next to nothing. So that's important to understand there. It's also important to understand that while the National Flood Insurance Program offers building coverage, now for contents coverage, private flood insurance can also offer something called loss of use, additional living expenses. What exactly is this? Well, imagine that this house right here was to flood and you needed a temporary place to live and you had a National Flood Insurance Program policy. Generally, you wouldn't have this coverage. But with a private flood insurance policy, you could. I know, because we had a customer that had about 6 months of a hotel provided for on their private flood insurance policy while their neighbors did not with the National Flood Insurance Program. It just took a major burden off of her, allowing her to get back up on her feet quicker financially because she had the coverage there. Now, it's important to understand that if we're talking about the National Flood Insurance Program, we're talking about private flood insurance, generally each one of these coverages has its own deductible. So it's important to understand that when you're picking deductibles with your coverages, you may not want to pick a $10,000 deductible because it could mean that you have a $10,000 deductible on the building. You have a $10,000 deductible on contents. You have a $10,000 deductible on additional living expenses. That could be a $30,000 deductible. That could be a big hit to your wallet. So you want to be careful picking those deductibles and keeping that in mind. Now let's talk about pricing with the private flood insurance market. While flood zones are no longer determined to use rates with the National Flood Insurance Program, many private companies still use them. Now, is it their leading factor? No. They look at a lot of different risk factors, just like the National Flood Insurance Program does, like you can see right here. Replacement cost of a property is a big factor. Distance to water, a type of flooding frequency, something called a flood risk score, which we have on our website, which will tell you the flood risk score of your property from 0 to 100. A lot of private flood insurance companies also use this to determine what their pricing model is going to be here. And of course, they base it on the amount of coverages that you're selecting. History of claims can have a big impact. In fact, in many situations, it can knock a lot of private companies out completely because some private companies will never insure a property that's had a claim. So it's important to understand that when looking at deciding to file a claim or not. Now let's talk about some of the wait periods. Unlike the National Flood Insurance Program, there's really only two types of wait periods with private. You've got one, which is the no loan closing, just like the National Flood Insurance Program. And the other one is your standard wait period. Now, depending on the private company, this could be a couple days. It could be up to 15 days. But generally, it's not going to be up to 30 days like it is with the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, what about claims? Now, it's important to understand that when we're talking about claims with the private flood insurance market, is completely different. Now, these are generally what's called non-admitted policies. This means you may not have the opportunity to appeal a claim like you would with the National Flood Insurance Program. However, you also don't have the red tape. I know we've handled more than 2,000 claims in 2022 with the National Flood Insurance Program or private flood insurance. And we find that private flood insurance claims generally can get settled quicker because you have less red tape that you're dealing with here because you're dealing directly with a private company and usually their reinsurance company. This also means that you may be able to get more coverage here. You may be able to get replacement costs on those contents. You may not be able to appeal a claims process, though. And you want to think about that as you're going and deciding between the National Flood Insurance Program and private flood insurance. So these are 5 things that we wanted to talk about. So in this video so far, we've talked about coverages, we've talked about pricing, we've talked about availability, we've talked about wait periods, and we've talked about claims. Now let's talk about what's the best solution for you. It's a question we hear from people every day. Hey, should I go with the National Flood Insurance Program or should I go with private flood insurance? And a lot of it comes down to, first of all, are you wanting something that's backed by the government or something that's backed by private companies? Because in many situations, the pricing with private flood insurance can seem much less. In fact, in many situations, we see where it's about 40% less than the National Flood Insurance Program. This could be a great benefit for you. One thing you want to look at before taking out that private flood insurance policy is what are the exclusions? What does the private company define as a flood? Because remember, with the National Flood Insurance Program, they define a flood as either 2 acres or 2 properties that have been flooded that were normally dry dry areas. Now, one of those has to be your property, but some private companies may only have the definition of one property. You want to make sure that you understand this before taking out the flood insurance. What we find out is that so many times people take out this policy and the policy would never pay out for what they're looking for because it was really more of a drainage issue. It was more of an issue with their neighbor's house than it was an actual flood. So make sure you pay attention to definitions and exclusions when picking between the National Flood Insurance Program and private flood insurance. Also, may depend on what part of the country you're in. For example, if you're in Florida, if you're in Louisiana, the National Flood Insurance Program may actually be a more stable situation for you there because the flood market is so volatile because of the hurricane-prone areas, just like areas like Myrtle Beach. You want to take a look, and when you're asking these questions, trying to decide between the National Flood Insurance Program and private, ask about, hey, what are the rates with this particular company look like over the last 3 years? Also, ask your agent, hey, what are my premiums going to look with the National Flood Insurance Program over the next 5 years? That's generally something they can take a look at, looking with full risk premium, looking at flood risk modeling. And if they can't, go over to our website and we'll kind of show you of what you could potentially expect with the way flood risk is changing with weather patterns, full risk premium with your National Flood Insurance Program policy, and what you can expect in year 2, year 3, and year 4. Because as you get ready to make this big purchase as a property owner, you want to prepare for today. You got to prepare for year 2, or year 3, or year 4. And that's really what we're trying to do here and help you understand that. That is the National Flood Insurance Program and private flood insurance in 2023. Now, if you want to learn more about the National Flood Insurance Program, between the differences between residential and commercial, click here in this video. If you want to learn, a better understanding of non-admitted versus admitted with private flood insurance, you can click up here as well, and you get an additional video there that goes into a little more detail. You can also click in the description where we've got some downloadable links for you to help you understand the difference here. One thing we've got also down there is 5 things to know before purchasing flood insurance. My name's Chris Green, president and owner of the Flood Insurance Guru, and I want to say thank you for tuning in to today's video on the National Flood Insurance Program versus private flood insurance. Thank you.